We paced the length of the hall, warily, checking over each cabin with our eyes, and finding not a single person within. Signs of a tremendous struggle were everywhere, and here and there amongst the clutter we would spot oddly alluring items of foreign craft. Statuettes of serpent-like dragons, tapestries depicting scenes of exaggerated beasts and mountain temples, broken pots filled with the mysterious-smelling incense, and a myriad of peculiar baubles wrought with an elaborate style. It was clear that the pirates had already plundered at least one merchant vessel, and plundered it thoroughly. At last we reached the hatch at the end of the hall, which assuredly led down into the cargo hold. "Sir!" One of the men whispered loudly. "Did you hear that?" I perked my ears, but there was nothing in the silence but the creaking of the ship's wooden hull. The men had claimed he had heard something, a thump or a movement below us in the lower deck. None else had heard it, not even I. So I raised the hatch and was assaulted furthermore by an increase in the stench. Its smell had shifted quality by this point, scarcely resembling the putrescence of decay, but now acidic and invasive. I pointed the light of my lantern downwards. The gloom below was then illuminated, revealing a massive but unorganized compilation of treasure. Gold and gems gleamed back at us, heaped in piles, strung on knotted silk cords. There were plates, bowls, goblets, armor, weapons, mirrors, masks, fine clothing. Again, all produced with a stunning craftsmanship that held an exotic and unfamiliar character. We moved down into the stinking cargo hold, having to restrain ourselves from diving into the wondrous plunder and hoarding it for our own. As we searched the long and shadowed chamber, I tried to keep an eye on the men. I promise you, I did. But my attention was stolen by the discovery that nearly every piece of treasure I came across was spattered with more blood. My carnal greed was mixed with disgust, and my heart grew sick at the thought of what price these men had paid for their terrible deed. It was at that moment that the piercing scream filled the air. I spun around. I saw one of the soldiers shrieking. On the ground in front of him lay a large chest, now laid open. From my viewpoint, I barely could glimpse its content. A statue of a wild-eyed demon, which radiated a sickly light and billowed with otherworldly vapors. The man who had opened the chest seemed paralyzed with shock. There was shouting all around as we readied our weapons and tried to gain sure footing amongst the littering of plunder. What happens next defies the imagination. Seeming to emerge from the shadows and vapors came a terrible creature. It stood easily as tall as 2 men, though likely it would have been taller had it not been for its hunched posture. It was a hulking brute, and its features are difficult to describe. It had an almost toad-like appearance, but with a small, glaring red eyes, a flat hog-like nose with appallingly large nostrils. Its hide was a sickly brownish green, and from its back sprouted spines. Its hands were massive and clawed, and its gaping mouth stretched nearly the entire width of its fat head, lined with a row of fangs, and from its body emanated that horrid stench that seemed to poison our very lungs. It grabbed the man standing before the open chest and bit into his body, ripping his arm from the shoulder. It threw him aside and strode forward, swallowing down the dismembered limb. Men shouted cries of battle and fear. They struck at the beast with blade and spear tip, but found it immensely difficult to penetrate its thick hide. They fought on, but the creature swatted them away. It slammed its fist into a soldier, caving in his breastplate and his chest. It snapped out with its gaping maw, biting away chunks of armor and flesh. As it moved, it was unhindered by the piles of stolen treasure heaped in the room, seeming to simply phase through it. "It is a demon of the abyss!" cried the mage as he directed his staff. Our hopes died when we saw his wizard's fire ripple along the creature's body like water falling from the scales of a fish. We reeled in horror, clamoring desperately for the exit ladder. The mage again loosed a gout of flame, still leaving the demon unharmed, but this time alighting the interior of the ship with fire. We threw ourselves forward, vaulting with the speed of panicked flight. Behind us, we could hear the wailing of those doomed to be slaughtered. Men crying in anguish and terror at the last violent moments of their lives. As my head emerged into the day-lit air, I shouted with all the fury of my being to our ship. "Draw in the anchor! Make all haste now! Flee!" I was but one of 4 men in the search crew that survived. But I shouldn't have. I should have stayed with my soldiers, fighting until my last dying breath. I say this not out of regret for forsaking my honor and duty as a captain, however. You see, as we sailed away, we watched that pirate ship go up in a blaze. We watched it sink, smoldering into the ocean. But we know we had not killed whatever had been set loose. The mage tried to comfort me with his theories. He said, "The magic which summoned that demon was very powerful, but likely temporary. By this point, I believe it has been called back to the churning abyss from whence it came." I started feeling a little better, but it did not last. About halfway back to Palagos, we were stopped for the better part of 2 days. We had anchored in a rocky cove as a forceful storm shook the sea. I had been asleep for a while when I was suddenly awakened by the sound of something scraping and pounding at the wall of my cabin from the outside. I quickly ran and told the others. We held up in the crew deck until the storm had passed, but none else had heard the sound. Many suggested to me that what I had heard was merely the storm. However, when we came to sail the next morning, we discovered that one of the crewmen was missing. Again, you tell me, maybe it had been the storm. Perhaps the man was tossed off the deck and dragged down by the undertow. Well, if you think me not a madman, then I leave you with this. When we finally arrive back in Ophora, kiss the ground, thank the gods to still be alive. I went immediately to inspect the ship, and lo and behold, on the outer wall, right outside where my cabin was, the wood was as shredded and splintered as if something very large had been trying to tear its way in, or perhaps even sink the ship. So, you can see why I would have rather died back on that pirate ship with my men. It would have been much better to meet a quick and a brutal death than to live on in dread, always wondering when that thing will come for me.